Old black man is humiliated by racist policemen, but then they cry in fear when they see that the old black man was someone they would never have imagined. If you are new here, I invite you to like the video and subscribe to the channel to help me bring you new stories. Omar, a man with black skin marked by time and the challenges of life, walked with slow but firm steps through the busy streets of the city center. His eyes, although tired, still carried the shine of someone who had already seen it all. He was a retired police colonel, a position he had conquered after years of dedication, facing the difficulties of a system that did not always respect his skin color or his origins. However, that afternoon, when he admired the watches, he was not interested only in their material value. For him, these objects represented something much greater: control over his own destiny. Omar was never a man of luxuries, but after so much time dedicated to military life, he felt that he deserved something that symbolized what he had achieved. He was thinking of buying one of those watches as a reminder that, despite everything, he still had control over his time, over his life. Two security guards, dressed in impeccable uniforms, slowly approached. "Hey, what are you doing there?" one of them asked, his tone dripping with disdain. There was no kindness in their voice, only the intention of imposing an authority they believed they had over this man. Omar, maintaining the calm he had developed over years of service, did not look away. He knew that situations like this were common, but never acceptable. Calmly, he replied, "I'm looking at the watches, thinking of buying one of them." Omar's answer, firm and direct, seemed almost an affront to the guards. They laughed, a laugh that resonated like a sharp blade. It was not a laugh of humor, but of cruelty. To them, the idea that this man could buy one of the expensive watches in the window was absurd. "You? Buy one of these?" one of them repeated mockingly, as if Omar had just told a joke. "You don't even have money to buy sandals." Those words cut Omar like a knife. It wasn't just a question of money. It was the blatant contempt, the implicit racism that had always been present in his life. "Who are you to tell me what I can or can't buy?" His voice was now louder and full of conviction. His eyes, once calm, now shone with the intensity of someone who refuses to be treated with less dignity than he deserves. He stared at the guards, and in that moment it was as if all the injustice he had suffered throughout his life came back in a single instant. The guards, realizing that Omar was not the kind of man who would cower under provocation, reacted. Their expressions changed from mockery to contempt. They moved closer, invading Omar's personal space, like predators surrounding their prey. "Old man, tone it down. You're not the boss here," one of them growled, pushing him lightly with his chest. Omar, who had spent his whole life maintaining control in confrontational situations, felt the old impulse of self-defense take over. He was no longer a simple old man in a watch shop. Now he was again the colonel who had already faced much worse situations than the provocation of two ignorant men. But the reality of his age and the racist society he lived in weighed on him. One wrong move could change his life forever. The guards were ready to provoke further. They cared nothing for the truth or who Omar was. To them, he was not worthy of respect, and this was an opportunity to reassert their power over someone they considered inferior. The growing noise of his words began to attract the glances of other passers-by, but the guards did not back down. They knew that, more often than not, people like Omar did not receive support from a society that frequently relegated them to the margins. The crowd was beginning to gather. The curious people watched the scene without intervening, as if they were watching an unpleasant spectacle. It was the public humiliation of Omar, a man who carried the weight of decades of service on his shoulders, being treated as if he were nothing, as if he were invisible or, worse, as a problem that had to be solved. "Do you think you can talk to us like that, old man?" One of the guards provoked him while giving him a light push on the chest. The gesture, although seemingly insignificant, was a symbol of the lack of respect they felt for Omar. Omar tried to remain calm, taking a deep breath, but the rage burned in his chest like a flame that could not be extinguished. He knew he could not allow these men to treat him that way. "You have no right to treat me like that." Omar raised his voice, the sound firm and full of conviction. His years of command came to the surface, and his posture was not that of someone defeated, but that of a man who knew he deserved respect, regardless of the situation. However, his voice, full of strength and history, was not enough to stop the guards. They came even closer. The crowd around him was barely breathing, while one of the guards growled, a cruel smile on his face. "Old man, don't tell us what we can or can't do." And then, with a sharp movement, they pushed Omar harder, this time making him lose his balance. His body, tired by the years, did not have the agility it used to, and he fell to the ground with a dull thud. The physical pain was almost insignificant compared to the emotional pain that hit him at that moment. Omar's fall was a moment frozen in time, where all the wounds of society, of structural racism, and of the lack of respect for black lives have become a moment of despair. They materialized in a raw and brutal way. There, on the ground, Omar was not just an elderly man. He represented decades, centuries of injustices suffered by many like him. The crowd watched in silence, complicit in a society that often prefers to look the other way. But Omar, even down, was not a broken man. He knew there was something bigger at stake here. It wasn't just about him, his pride, or his dignity. It was about an entire system that tried to crush people like him, and he wouldn't let that happen. With effort, he began to get up. The pain in his leg and back was intense, but his resolve was stronger. Omar would not be defeated by a push, by a provocation. As he stood, his gaze fixed on the guards, the crowd around him began to murmur, as if something within them finally recognized the injustice of what was happening. But still, no one had the courage to speak. Omar, now standing, looked directly at the men who had brought him down. "I'm not just anyone," he said with a calm that hid the storm inside him. "And you're going to pay for this." The guards, realizing that Omar would not be so easily intimidated, began to grow irritated. The man's defiant stance made them uncomfortable, and the desire to humiliate him further only grew. But what they didn't know was that at that moment, the tide was about to turn in a way they could never have imagined. Omar was no simple citizen. He was a former police colonel, and his experience, his authority, and his dignity were about to take over. Omar, even wounded, knew that he could not back down. His experience in the police, the discipline of a lifetime dedicated to public service, had taught him not to bow his head in the face of injustice. His pride, his integrity, were at stake at that moment. "Old man, you better get out of here before things get really bad," threatened one of the guards, approaching again, this time more aggressively. The other guard followed close behind, ready to transform that verbal humiliation into something physical, something that Omar could not forget so easily. But Omar, with his long experience in confrontations, was not to be intimidated. He knew that the situation had exceeded all acceptable limits, and that his only way out would be to respond with the same firmness. "What you are doing is a mistake, and I will not accept it," he said, his voice firm but charged with emotion. However, Omar's gesture and words were not enough to stop the guards, who were already determined to impose their force. With a sudden movement, one of the men tried to grab Omar again, this time with more violence. It was at that moment that Omar's instinct for self-defense, something cultivated during decades of military and police service, took over. With a quick movement, He freed himself from the hands of the guard who tried to hold him. The crowd watched, now more agitated, murmuring among themselves. It seemed that the imminent physical confrontation was inevitable. And then, as a reflection of his long career, Omar made a decision that would change everything. With a quick and precise movement, he pulled out his weapon, a pistol that he still carried with him for reasons of personal safety. It was not a threat, but a way of showing that he was not there to be intimidated or subjugated. The crowd, seeing the gun, instinctively stepped back. The silence was broken by whispers and murmurs of surprise. The guards were momentarily paralyzed, their faces taken by a mixture of surprise and fear. They had not expected that this man, whom they judged to be defenseless, could react with such determination. But the tension in the air was far from resolved. It was a confrontation of power, pride, and dignity. And now, with a gun in sight, the situation had transformed into something much more serious. It was at that precise moment that fate, in a tragic and brutal way, manifested itself. A police car drove by, its headlights shining on the street. The policeman inside the vehicle, seeing the confusion and the gun in Omar's hands, acted without thinking. Without assessing the situation, without asking or trying to understand what was happening, they immediately pulled out their own weapons. Omar, still holding his gun, had no time to react. The sound of gunfire echoed through the street, ripping through the air with a violence he knew all too well, but which, at that moment, seemed unfairly directed at him. The bullets found their mark, and Omar felt a devastating impact on his leg. The pain was instantaneous, a sensation that made him stagger, and for a moment, lose his balance. He fell again, this time not pushed by the guards, but by the relentless force of the bullets fired by the police. The ground, hard and cold, received his wounded body, but his mind was still alert, fighting the pain and confusion. He could not believe what had just happened. The man who, for decades, had served in the police, who had worn the uniform with honor and dignity, was now the target of the very men who, under other circumstances, might have been his comrades. Time seemed to slow down as Omar lay on the ground. The sounds around him grew distant. He heard the quick footsteps of the policemen approaching, but he knew that this was no longer an enemy. As they surrounded him, guns still raised, Omar raised his voice with all the strength he had left. "I am a retired police colonel." The revelation of his identity fell on the policemen like a ton of bricks. The shock on their faces was evident. They had just shot one of their own, without even taking the trouble to question what was happening. The chaos of the situation dissipated for a brief moment, replaced by guilt and fear in the policemen's eyes. Without hesitation, they rushed to his aid, trying to remedy the mistake they had made. "Colonel, we didn't know," one of the policemen stammered, his voice shaking with fear. They helped Omar to his feet, placing him on a makeshift stretcher. The crowd around, now restless, watched in silence. The system that Omar had served for so many years had betrayed him, but he, even wounded, would not allow that betrayal to go unanswered. The crowd, which had previously watched with morbid curiosity, now watched in complete silence, shocked by the violent outcome of that scene that had begun as a simple verbal dispute. Omar, his voice hoarse but firm, looked directly into the eyes of the policeman. There was no fear in him, only a deep disappointment, a bitterness that years of public service had not managed to erase. And then, without hesitation, he spoke the words that would change everything. "I am Colonel Omar, retired police colonel." The words fell like a bomb on the two policemen. For a moment, the world around them seemed to freeze. The expressions of the officers changed rapidly. The shock was immediate, followed by an almost comical confusion. The man they had shot, without even considering another alternative, was not a common criminal, not just any man. He was a former police officer, a colonel, someone who had dedicated decades of his life to protecting the very streets where he now lay, wounded by those who should have protected him. The policeman's eyes widened in disbelief. They looked at each other, unable to believe what they had just done. The younger of the two took a step back, the gun still shaking in his hand, fear and panic beginning to take over his mind. The other, more experienced, quickly lowered the gun, as if the object in his hands had transformed into something unclean, something he should never have used against that man. "Colonel, we didn't know," one of the policemen finally muttered, his voice shaking, almost suffocated by the guilt that now weighed on his shoulders. They approached quickly, as if the rush to correct the mistake could erase what they had done. But Omar, although still on the ground, did not look at them with pity. He knew the police system better than anyone else, and he knew that for many, his black skin was seen as a threat, regardless of his position, his history, or his accomplishments. The policeman, still stunned, knelt beside Omar, trying to help him up. The colonel, despite the pain throbbing in his leg, allowed them to assist him, but his gaze was cold, stern. "They didn't ask questions," he said, his voice controlled despite the obvious pain. "They shot first and asked questions later. They learned nothing." His words were like knives cutting into the consciousness of the two men who were now desperately trying to make amends. With the help of the policeman, Omar was carefully placed on a makeshift stretcher, while the ambulance was urgently called. The sound of distant sirens was beginning to fill the air, but the emotional silence among those present was overwhelming. The guards, who had previously laughed in contempt, now stood frozen, their faces pale and expressionless, as they realized they had set off a chain of events that had spiraled completely out of control. The pain in Omar's leg continued to throb, but he held his head high. He was a man who, no matter how wounded he was, did not allow injustice to go unnoticed. He had faced dangerous situations before, but this was different. It was not just a matter of physical survival. It was about the survival of his dignity, of his story. He knew he could not allow what happened that day to simply be forgotten or ignored. As the police officers tried to control the situation, one of them, still stunned, looked at Omar, his eyes wide with terror. "Colonel, please, we didn't know it was you." The voice was almost a whisper, as if he were trying to find some kind of redemption in that apology. But Omar, with a stern expression, simply replied, "It wasn't about who I am. They didn't even try to find out." Omar's words echoed through the street, laden with bitter wisdom. He knew that his position as a colonel, as a man in uniform, could eventually protect him from the worst consequences. But what if it had been someone else? What if it had been an ordinary black man with no title, no military career to back him up? The truth was clear and brutal. He was shot not because of who he was, but because of what he stood for. The color of his skin, in the eyes of those police officers, was enough to consider him a threat. Time seemed to slow down as the ambulance finally arrived. Omar was carefully placed inside and the paramedics acted quickly to stem the bleeding in his leg. As he was taken away, the police officers stood nearby, in a mixture of guilt and fear. They knew their careers, and perhaps their lives, were about to change forever. Omar, lying on the stretcher, looked up at the sky as the ambulance door closed. The silence around him contrasted with the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. He knew that what had happened that day would not end there. The security guards, the police officers, everyone would have to face the consequences of their actions. He would not rest until justice was served. The drive to the hospital would only be the first step in a long process of repair. Omar, even wounded, was already beginning to plan his next moves. He knew that the physical pain would soon pass, but the emotional pain, the wound in his soul, would be much harder to heal. When the ambulance finally arrived at the hospital, Omar was immediately taken in for treatment. The pain in his leg was unbearable, but he endured it in silence, with the steadfastness of someone who had already faced much greater challenges. The cold lights of the hospital, the sound of the machines, and the accelerated pace of the nurses around him were almost background noise. What dominated his thoughts was the next step. He had evidence, he had witnesses, and above all, he had the truth on his side. During the treatment, while the doctors tended to his wound, Omar stood firm. Each procedure, each needle that pierced his skin, was nothing compared to the emotional pain he felt. He knew that this incident was not an isolated case. How many other men, black like him, did not have the same opportunity to defend themselves? How many had already been silenced by violence and injustice, with no one caring? He would not allow his case to be just another in the statistics. After a few hours of treatment, Omar was taken to a room where he would finally have a moment to rest. But rest was not an option for him. His thoughts were clear and focused. Still in the hospital, Omar did what he had to do. He contacted his lawyers, sent messages to former trusted colleagues within the police, and began to organize his plan of action. The complaint would be formalized. The security guards would be held responsible for the racist and violent treatment, and the police officers, for their part, would have to answer for the recklessness and abuse of force that nearly cost him his life. However, obstacles began to arise even before the process was officially started. The store where the incident had occurred, fearing public repercussions and damage to its reputation, acted quickly to remove any evidence that could incriminate them. The internal security cameras that could have captured the entire interaction between Omar and the security guards were mysteriously erased, as if the incident had never happened. It was a blow, but Omar was unfazed. He knew that this would only be the beginning of the defense maneuvers. However, he was a man experienced in pressure situations, and he had a plan. Omar knew the downtown area where it all happened well. He knew that in addition to the store's internal cameras, there were many others spread across the street in neighboring establishments that could have recorded what happened outside. Every step, every detail of the incident was now recorded on cameras that did not belong to the store, and Omar would use that information to his advantage. At his lawyer's office, the two began to map out the strategy. The images captured by those cameras would be essential. They would clearly show the sequence of events. The security guards taunting and pushing Omar, the public humiliation, the reaction of self-defense by pulling out his gun, and finally, the arrival of the police who, without any questions, shot an innocent man. Omar knew that those images had a power that no words could have. The next step was to formalize the complaints against the security guards and the police officers involved. Omar's lawyer carefully drafted each line, each accusation, making sure that all the details of the incident were presented clearly and objectively. The security guards would be accused not only of assault, but also of racial discrimination, something that would be evident not only by the words exchanged, but by the attitude of the men who believed that just because Omar was a black man, he had no right to be there, to defend himself, or to possess anything of value. As for the police officers, the accusation was clear: excessive use of force, reckless shooting, and inappropriate conduct. Omar knew that it would not be easy to hold his former colleagues in uniform accountable, but he could not allow what had happened to go unpunished. He did not see them just as police officers, but as agents of a system that had failed people like him for so long. Justice, he thought, could not make distinctions based on skin color or uniform. Everyone was responsible for their actions. Preparation for the hearing began immediately. Omar's lawyer contacted the owners of the neighboring stores, formally requesting the security camera recordings. Although some shops were hesitant at first, fearing to be involved in such a sensitive case, Omar's reputation and past as a retired police colonel opened doors that might otherwise have been closed. The owners understood that Omar was not seeking revenge, but justice, and they handed over the footage without hesitation. With the footage in hand, the lawyer began to organize Omar's line of defense. The footage clearly showed that he had been provoked, humiliated, and assaulted before any reaction on his part. It also made it clear that the security guards acted with contempt and racism, pushing him and treating him with disdain. The behavior of the police officers, for their part, was even more disturbing. The video clearly showed that they fired before even assessing the situation, shooting a man who posed no real threat at the time. The trial was set. Omar prepared for battle. He had fought on many fronts throughout his life, but this would undoubtedly be one of the most difficult. It was not just a fight for his own dignity, but for all those who, like him, had already fallen victim to a system that refused to see them as equals. The big day had finally arrived. The courtroom was packed, and the air was thick with anticipation. The courtroom doors opened to begin a trial that would not only put security guards and police officers in the dock, but would also shed light on deeper issues of racism and abuse of power. In that setting, all eyes were on Omar. The press, the curious, and even the defendants themselves were all looking at Omar, trying to size up the man who had faced so much, and who even after all was still standing. The security guards, Miguel and Alex, sat with tense expressions. Nervousness was evident in their gestures. After all, they knew that it was not just the incident with Omar that was on trial, but also his racist and contemptuous behavior displayed in public. At his side, Daniel and Ricardo, the police officers who had shot Omar, maintained a rigid posture, but traces of concern were undeniable. For them, it had all started as a routine intervention, but recklessness and prejudice had revealed themselves to be fatal errors. Now they were there, no longer protected by the uniform, but as defendants, about to face the consequences of their actions. Judge Diego, a black-skinned man, looked intently at the documents in front of him. It was a symbol of justice, but he also knew that this case carried greater weight than usual. Diego knew the reality of being a black man in a position of power, and felt deeply what was at stake. He also knew that his sentence would be questioned, accused of bias by some, but that did not intimidate him. He would not judge based on the color of one's skin, but based on the truth of the facts that would be presented before him. The hearing began with Omar's testimony. He recounted in detail every moment of that fateful day, from the guard's first intervention to the moment the police shot him. His voice, firm and controlled, conveyed a natural authority. Every word hung in the air, and the courtroom was absolutely silent as he spoke. It was not just a narrative. It was the stark reality of a man who, despite having dedicated a lifetime to police service, was treated as a dangerous suspect just because of his skin color. Next came the visual evidence. The security camera footage clearly showed Miguel and Alex laughing and taunting Omar, pushing him and treating him with contempt. There was no denying what was before everyone's eyes. Omar, although pushed to the ground, only reacted when his dignity was completely crushed. The footage also showed the arrival of the police officers, Daniel and Ricardo, who, without hesitation, pulled out their guns and shot Omar before assessing the situation. The guards, seeing the images projected on the screen, lowered their heads. They knew there was no escape. The evidence was overwhelming. For their part, the police officers maintained a hard expression, but the tension in their faces betrayed the weight of guilt, which was now undeniable. They had failed in their duty to protect and serve, and now they were about to face the consequences. Omar's lawyer presented his case with surgical precision. This was not just an isolated act of discrimination, but a systemic practice that placed black men in a position of constant suspicion. Omar was a retired colonel, a man who had dedicated his life to public service. But that day, he was not seen as such. He was reduced to a stereotype, and that more than anything else was what the court needed to judge. After the testimonies and the presentation of evidence, Judge Diego paused before passing sentence. The silence in the room was absolute. Every person present knew that this moment would be decisive. Diego, with his solemn posture, began to speak. He stressed that justice should be blind to race, class, or social standing, and that everyone, regardless of their background, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. He stressed that what happened to Omar was unacceptable, and that those who abused their power and position should be held accountable. The sentence was clear. The security guards, Miguel and Alex, were sentenced to 2 years in prison and a fine of $30,000 each for assault and racial profiling. They had triggered the chain of events that nearly cost an innocent man his life, and now they would pay the price for their actions. The shock of the sentence was evident on the faces of the two men, who until then believed they could get away with it. As for the police officers, Daniel and Ricardo, the sentence was even harsher. They were suspended from duty and sentenced to 3 years in prison for abuse of authority and excessive use of force. The trust the public had placed in them was betrayed, and that was something the court could not ignore. Justice had finally prevailed, and the two men who had once worn the uniform of the law to protect now wore it as defendants. When the sentence was read, the courtroom fell silent for a moment. The gravity of the situation had been recognized. For Daniel and Ricardo, the convicted police officers, and Miguel and Alex, the security guards, the sentence was not the end. For them, that sentence symbolized something much deeper than a simple judicial punishment. It was a betrayal, an open wound that would not easily heal. They did not see justice as a fair reparation for Omar. In their minds, they had been wrongfully convicted by a system that, at the time, they believed was corrupted by racial favoritism. "He only won because he is just like the judge," Daniel growled, his voice full of resentment. He saw no justice, only the color of Omar's and Judge Diego's skin. Ricardo, who until then had remained silent, nodded in agreement. This was a setup from the start. We didn't stand a chance. The two policemen, still in their uniforms but without the dignity they had before, felt the weight of the revolt burning within them. They had lost their positions, their honor, and in their minds there was only one cause: the reverse racism they believed they had suffered. "This is not going to stay like this," Alex muttered, anger burning in his voice. "He put us here. He threw us into the mud, but we will not go down alone." The plan for revenge began to take shape in the hearts of the 4 men gathered there. What had started as a trial for them was now becoming a matter of wounded pride and growing hatred. It was not only Omar who was the target of their anger. So was Judge Diego, who had handed down the sentence, and who, in the men's minds, had condemned them not for their actions, but because he and Omar shared the same skin color. The 4 of them looked at each other, forming a kind of nonverbal pact at that very moment. The seeds of revenge were planted, and now they just needed the right moment to act. It wouldn't be simple retaliation. They wanted something that went beyond physical violence. They wanted to destroy Omar and Diego, not just with force, but with the psychological cruelty of those who have been dragged to the bottom of the well, and now want to drag others with them. Daniel, with his experience and knowledge of the internal systems of the police, began to draw up the first outlines of the plan. "We're going to start with the judge," he said, his eyes cold and calculating. "He's the key. If we catch him, Omar will fall apart, and we have to do it in a way that they feel what it's like to lose everything, feel what it's like to be destroyed from the inside out." Daniel's rage, combined with his experience in operations, made him the natural leader of the group. Ricardo, who had always been more impulsive, quickly agreed. "Carmen," he said with a cruel smile, "the judge's wife. If we catch her, he will do whatever we want. The plan was beginning to take shape. Kidnap Carmen, Judge Diego's pregnant wife, and use her as a bargaining chip, demanding $1 million ransom. But beyond that, destabilize the man they believed had unfairly favored Omar. They knew Diego would do anything to save his wife and the child she was carrying in her womb. It was a calculated, cold blow, and in the minds of the conspirators, it would be the beginning of their revenge. But Omar was also in their sights. For him, the plan would be even crueler. It wasn't enough to hurt him physically. They wanted to leave him isolated, defenseless, humiliated, as they felt now. "And Omar?" Miguel asked, his eyes full of hate. Daniel, once again assuming the lead, answered calmly, "Omar will pay dearly, but not here. We will kidnap him and leave him on a desert island, far from everything. He will die slowly, alone, without dignity, without honor." The park was relatively empty that morning. It was a place she visited frequently. She knew the most isolated corners, and she liked to walk in silence, immersed in her thoughts. Pregnancy brought her a feeling of fulfillment, but there were also moments of tiredness, and the walks helped relieve the accumulated tension. As Carmen walked along one of the park's less traveled paths, a subtle feeling of alertness began to run through her body. Maybe it was intuition, that inner voice that sometimes tries to warn us of impending danger. She looked around, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, the silence was beginning to become oppressive, and her steps, once light, became more hesitant. Carmen didn't know it, but Daniel and Ricardo had been watching her for weeks. They knew her every move, every routine. They chose that moment with surgical precision. The ambush was about to begin. The attack was sudden, without warning, and devastatingly fast. Daniel and Ricardo, disguised as casual joggers, approached from the sides of the path. Within seconds, Carmen's calm face turned to absolute panic as a strong, rough hand covered her mouth, preventing her from screaming. Her heart raced. Fear enveloped her in a way she had never experienced before. She tried to fight, but her physical condition and surprise made her vulnerable. The men's strength was overwhelming, and within moments Carmen was dragged off the path. Her muffled screams echoed through the emptiness of the park, but there was no one around to hear her. Her eyes, widened with terror, searched for some kind of help, but found only the merciless coldness in the faces of her kidnappers. Ricardo, his face half covered, looked her straight in the eyes, and the brutality of his gaze made Carmen realize that this was not just a robbery. This was something much bigger, something personal. Daniel and Ricardo dragged her into a room, car that was parked in a more remote area of the park, away from any curious eyes. Carmen tried to resist, but she was weak, both from the pregnancy and from the shock. In the back seat of the vehicle, gagged and tied, Carmen sat listening to the sound of an engine. She felt hopelessness growing inside her. The fear was not only for her life, but for the baby she was carrying in her womb. Her body trembled, not only from the brutality of what was happening, but from the terror of thinking that something could happen to her child. As the car drove away from the park, the scene that had previously seemed so peaceful and familiar to her began to fade, giving way to a journey full of uncertainties. Daniel and Ricardo's plan for revenge was in full swing. They knew that Judge Diego, a man of power and prestige, would do anything to save his wife. And that was exactly what they wanted, to see him fall apart, destroyed by fear, begging for mercy. For them, it was not just a matter of money. The $1 million ransom they would demand was only part of the heist. The real goal was to dismantle the judge's life, to rip away everything he held most dear. The ride to the captivity was silent, save for the muffled sounds of Carmen trying, in vain, to break free from her bonds. She was terrified, but she tried to stay calm for her son. She knew that if she gave herself over completely to fear, she could lose control, Her thoughts kept returning to Diego, and the only thing keeping her strong was the hope that he would find a way to save her. Carmen knew how determined Diego was, but what she didn't know was that, at that moment, he still had no idea of the hell that was about to begin. The captivity was an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, an isolated place where no one would ever think to look. Upon arrival, Carmen was taken inside, where she was placed in a small windowless room lit only by a dim light bulb. Her captors left her tied to a chair, and there, in the oppressive silence of that room, she felt the magnitude of her situation. There was no one to help her, no one to hear her screams. She was alone, surrounded by enemies, invisible friends, not knowing what the future held for her or her baby. Meanwhile, the news of Carmen's disappearance had not yet reached Diego. He was at home, believing that his wife was enjoying one more quiet morning in the park, not imagining that the security of his family life was about to crumble. The phone, which he always left nearby, suddenly vibrated, breaking the momentary peace of the morning. Diego answered without haste, not knowing that this call would change everything. The voice on the other end of the line was cold, calculating, and went straight to the point. "We have your wife, Judge, and the child she is carrying in her womb. If you want to see them alive again, you will pay us $1 million. And don't even think about involving the police. If you do, you'll never see Carmen again." Diego froze. His hands shook and his breathing hitched for an instant. The magnitude of what he had just heard hit him like an avalanche. His mind panicked and the ground beneath his feet seemed to disappear. "Carmen," he stammered, unable to believe what was happening. The voice on the other end of the line remained impassive, devoid of any trace of compassion. "You have 48 hours, Judge. Don't fail. And remember, no police." The phone fell from Diego's hands. He was paralyzed, unable to process the reality in front of him. His wife, his Carmen, the woman who carried his child, had been kidnapped. And he, a man of justice, was at the mercy of criminals thirsty for revenge. Diego, who had spent his life judging others, now found himself trapped in his own trial, where the price of the sentence would be the lives of his family. The next few hours would be a nightmare for Diego. He knew he couldn't just pay the ransom without further ado, but he couldn't risk the lives of his wife and son either. He was caught between duty and desperation, and every second that passed was a blow to his heart. The fear of losing everything he loved most was overwhelming. On the other hand, Carmen, still a prisoner in captivity, didn't know that her husband was now fighting against the clock to save their lives. Daniel and Ricardo's wicked plan was underway, and for them, every minute of Diego's pain and despair was a personal victory. The first blow had been struck, and they hoped that, before long, the judge would be on his knees, ready to give in to their demands. While Carmen was being held, tied up in captivity, the second act of Daniel, Ricardo, Miguel, and Alex's wicked revenge was advancing mercilessly. That same night, when darkness was already enveloping the city and the silent streets seemed safe, Omar, at home, was about to face the darkest moment of his life. Omar was home alone, still recovering from the emotional and physical wounds of the previous incident. His days had been filled with a quiet routine, far from the tumult of the battles of old. His body was no longer as agile as it once was, and the wound on his leg still reminded him of what had happened. He believed that, after the trial, he would be able to live in peace. Little did he know that vengeance was lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. Miguel and Alex, the security guards who had sworn vengeance, watched Omar's house patiently. They knew that he lived alone and that the best time to act would be at night, when the city slept and surveillance was minimal. They had laid out every detail of the plan, counting on the element of surprise and Omar's vulnerability. What they wanted was more than simple revenge. They wanted to destroy him from within, to drive him to despair, to helplessness. Omar's fate would not be a quick and violent death, but abandonment and solitary suffering. The time came. In the middle of the night, when Omar had already retired to rest, Miguel and Alex put the plan into motion. Equipped with tools to force their way into the house silently, they approached without making the slightest noise. Omar, lying in his bed, almost asleep, was suddenly awakened by a strange sound coming from the living room. His retired police instincts were still sharp, and he knew at that moment that something was wrong. He slowly stood up, leaning on his injured leg, and headed towards the noise. But before he could reach the door, it was violently opened, and two masked men entered with terrifying speed. Miguel and Alex, filled with hatred and thirst for revenge, advanced on Omar. Despite his advanced age and tired body, Omar tried to fight. His defensive instincts were still present, but the pain in his leg and the physical strength of his attackers made any attempt at resistance useless. They quickly overpowered him, tying his hands and feet with leather straps and gagging him so that he could not scream. The horror in Omar's eyes was evident. He had faced many enemies throughout his life, but he never expected to be attacked like this, inside his own home. "You thought you had won, didn't you?" Miguel whispered in Omar's ear, his voice full of contempt. "But now you are going to pay for what you did to us. We will see if you are as strong when you are alone, completely abandoned." Omar, bound and helpless, was dragged out of his house, his feet scraping the cold floor. His heart was beating uncontrollably in his chest, but he could do nothing but watch helplessly what was happening. Miguel and Alex loaded him into a black car with no license plates, ready to take him to his final destination, a deserted island in the middle of the ocean. The plan was simple and cruel. They would abandon him there, with no means of communication, without sufficient supplies, leaving him at the mercy of time and nature. For them, the worst sentence was not a quick death, but a slow and lonely one, in which their dignity and their life would slowly fade away. The car sped through the deserted streets of the city, heading for a coastal point where a boat was waiting for them. Omar was completely silent, his mind filled with questions and fears. What was happening? Why were they doing this to him? He couldn't believe that, after everything he had already faced, his life was once again spiraling into chaos and suffering. He thought about his son, Nicholas, and wondered if he would ever have the chance to see him again. As the car headed toward the coast, Omar began to feel that his end was near. He, who had spent his life fighting for justice and honor, was now on the verge of being abandoned, as if his life had no value. Fate seemed cruel, implacable. And Omar, with his mouth gagged, struggled to maintain control over his own thoughts, trying not to succumb to the fear that was beginning to dominate him. They arrived at the meeting point. There, a small boat was waiting for them. Miguel and Alex, without saying a word, dragged Omar out of the car and pulled him aboard. The sea was dark, with no end in sight, and the thought of being abandoned on a desert island made Omar feel a dread he had never experienced before. It wasn't just the loneliness that terrified him, but the thought that he would die there, forgotten by everyone. The boat began to sail out into the vast ocean, and every minute seemed like an eternity to Omar. His fate was sealed. Miguel and Alex's promise of revenge was about to be fulfilled. But what they didn't know was that Omar's son, Nicholas, had taken a precaution that would completely change the course of events. Nicholas, a police lieutenant, had always had a protective instinct toward his father. Knowing that Omar could be in danger after the trial, Nicholas had installed a tracker in his father's car, a small device that would activate if Omar left town without warning. That night, as Nicholas slept, the silent alert vibrated on his cell phone. The young lieutenant suddenly woke up, sensing that something was wrong. Still half asleep, Nicholas looked at the screen of his cell phone. The tracker he had secretly installed in his father's car was activated, an alert that, under any other circumstances, he could have ignored. But that night was different. Panic began to take hold of him. He knew his father. He knew that Omar was not the type to simply leave home without warning, especially at that time of night. Something was terribly wrong. Quickly sitting up in bed, Nicholas opened the tracking map and saw, to his horror, that his father's car was heading towards the coast, away from the city, on a completely unusual route. It was as if Omar was being taken away from the safety of his home, towards a destination that Nicholas still could not understand, but that he somehow knew was not good. His fingers shook as he frantically navigated the details of the journey, and his racing heart hammered at the thought that his father was in danger. Picking up the phone, Nicholas began calling his superiors and colleagues at the police force. His voice was firm, but charged with urgency. "I need all available units now," he ordered, leaving no room for questions. He briefly explained the situation, mentioning that his father was missing and that the tracker in the car indicated a dangerous location. The police department, knowing the respect Omar had always had among his former colleagues, mobilized its units immediately. Patrol cars were dispatched, helicopters prepared to fly over the coastal area. The rescue operation was underway. As he organized the operation, Nicholas could not get the image of his father out of his mind. He knew that Omar was vulnerable. Even recovering from the emotional and physical wounds of the trial, his father would not be able to defend himself alone. The memory of the trial, of the revenge promised by Daniel, Ricardo, Miguel, and Alex, came back to Nicholas's mind like an overwhelming wave. He knew that they were capable of anything, and his father's fate was now in his hands. The police began to follow the tracker's signal. Patrol cars drove through the deserted streets of the city, cutting through the silence of the night with sirens that echoed through the alleys and avenues. Nicholas, with a map open on the dashboard of the patrol car, observed each change in the signal, knowing that he was getting closer to reaching his father. But there was something he could not foresee: the total darkness that was approaching, the endless ocean that could swallow his father forever. The police, well coordinated, established a meeting point on the coast, where the signal indicated that Omar's car was approaching the sea. Nicholas knew that they would have to be fast, precise, and that any mistake could cost his father his life. When they arrived at the place, a small abandoned port, the lights of the patrol cars illuminated the dense darkness of the night. Omar's car was no longer there, but the signal from the tracker was still beating strongly. The boat. His father had been taken away on a boat. Nicholas, without wasting time, called the police maritime unit. Helicopters were already flying over the coast, trying to locate any sign of suspicious vessels. Adrenaline was running through his veins, and time seemed to drag on as he waited for a response from the helicopter pilots. "We have to find them before they reach the open sea," thought Nicholas, aware that, once in deep waters, rescuing Omar would become an almost impossible task. The patrol radio crackled, and the voice of the helicopter pilot came like a ray of hope. "We have a suspicious vessel about 2 kilometers from the coast, heading south. Let's intercept them." Nicholas's heart raced. They were close, very close. Now everything depended on the speed of the police to reach that boat before Miguel and Alex's plan for revenge was fulfilled. The maritime patrols began to advance across the sea. The boat's spotlights cut through the darkness of the ocean, looking for any sign of the boat carrying Omar. Meanwhile, on the kidnapper's boat, Omar was tied up and gagged. Unable to move, listening only to the sound of the sea around him. He knew that he was being taken far away, towards a grim destiny. Loneliness was beginning to take hold of him, and for a moment, Omar thought that maybe that would be the end for him. But what he didn't know was that his son, Nicholas, was closer than he could ever imagine. The chase at sea was in full swing, and police lights began to illuminate the distant horizon, rapidly approaching the boat. Miguel and Alex, realizing they were being followed, tried to speed up the boat, but it was too late. The police boats surrounded them with military efficiency, blocking any escape route. The revenge they had meticulously planned was crumbling before their eyes. "Surrender! You're surrounded!" the police shouted through megaphones as the police boats approached. Miguel and Alex, with no way out, tried to fight back, but they knew the battle was lost. The police boarded the boat quickly, arresting them before they could do anything else. Nicholas, on one of the boats, was the first to jump onto the boat where his father was being held prisoner. His heart was pounding, and his eyes were fixed on the bound figure on the ground. Approaching Omar, Nicholas, his hands shaking with emotion, untied his father. The relief he felt was indescribable. Omar, weak and exhausted, looked into his son's eyes, and for a brief moment saw all the sacrifice and love that had been dedicated to that rescue. "Dad, you're safe. I'm here," Nicholas said, his voice cracking with emotion. Omar, still panting, couldn't respond immediately, but his eyes, full of gratitude and pride, said it all. The rescue operation had been a success. Nicholas, with his determination and intelligence, had managed to save his father from certain death. Miguel and Alex were arrested and taken to the police station, and as the night finally began to dissipate, Omar was taken back to shore, where he would be treated by doctors. The nightmare, at least for now, was over. But the victory was not complete. Nicholas knew that the masterminds behind that kidnapping, Daniel and Ricardo, the ex-policemen who orchestrated everything, were still free. The chase for justice was not over, and the police began planning the capture of the men behind that whole sinister plan. Upon reaching the coast, Omar was taken to a hospital where he would be evaluated by doctors after the trauma of the previous night. Nicolas, however, did not allow himself to rest. He knew that every second was crucial. He coordinated with his fellow police officers the next phase, a search and capture operation for Daniel and Ricardo. During the interrogation, Miguel and Alex, pressured by investigators and aware that they were cornered, finally confessed. They revealed that Daniel and Ricardo had an escape plan prepared. They knew that, if something went wrong, the two ex-policemen planned to escape the country. The final destination would be Thailand, a place where they could hide from the authorities and start over, far from the justice that was chasing them. With these confessions in hand, the police now had the thread they needed to track down the two men. Nicholas, determined to prevent the culprits from escaping, immediately mobilized his team. They knew that Daniel and Ricardo were planning to flee through the airport, and that time was of the essence. If they managed to get through security and board the flight, capturing them would be much more complicated. The urgency of the situation meant that every police officer involved in the operation was on high alert. The airport, which was already beginning to fill up with people for the first flights of the morning, became the scene of the hunt. Nicolas and his team arrived quickly, disguised among the travelers, watching every move carefully. They had an accurate description of Daniel and Ricardo, and they knew that the two would try to flee without raising suspicion. The police plan was simple: intercept them before they reached the boarding gate. While the police spread out through the terminal, Nicholas remained in constant contact with his intelligence team, who monitored the airport security cameras. Every face was analyzed, every movement carefully observed. The nervousness was palpable, but the determination to capture Daniel and Ricardo was even stronger. The two men, until that moment, believed they could escape unpunished, but Nicholas knew that justice would catch up with them. Suddenly, a message came over the radio. "We have identified the two. They are heading towards the boarding gate of the international flight." Nicholas's heart raced. It was the decisive moment. With military precision, he and his team began to move discreetly towards the indicated gate. Daniel and Ricardo, with backpacks and casual clothes, were just a few steps away from their escape, believing that they had already left the danger behind. But when they were about to pass through the final boarding control, the police acted. Quickly and efficiently, Nicholas and his team surrounded the two men, giving them no chance to react. "Police, you are under arrest!" shouted Nicolas, with a firm and authoritative voice that cut through the murmur of conversations around them. Daniel and Ricardo, surprised, had no time to react. Their shocked expressions revealed that they had not expected to be captured so quickly. The police officers handcuffed the two ex-cops on the spot, and the crowd at the airport, initially confused, began to watch with curiosity. Daniel and Ricardo were restrained and led away in silence. Their escape attempt had failed, and now, finally, they would face the consequences of their crimes. Nicolas, watching as the two men were escorted out of the terminal, felt a mix of relief and determination. He knew that justice had prevailed, but he also understood that the struggle of his family, and especially his father, would leave deep scars. As the police officers led Daniel and Ricardo towards the police vehicles waiting for them outside the airport, Nicolas allowed himself a moment of reflection. The brutal revenge the two had planned had failed, but the impact of the previous night still resonated in the air. Carmen, Judge Diego's wife, was still kidnapped, and although Omar had been rescued, he had been put through an unimaginable ordeal. There was still much to be done. But at that moment, the capture of Daniel and Ricardo was a crucial victory. Back at the police station, Daniel and Ricardo were formally charged with kidnapping, conspiracy, and attempted murder. The evidence was overwhelming, and with Miguel and Alex also arrested, the revenge operation they had planned had completely collapsed. Judge Diego, still desperate over Carmen's kidnapping, received the news of the two men's arrest with a mixture of relief and anxiety. He knew that the fight for his wife's life was not yet over. Nicolas, now a little more at ease, returned to the hospital to see his father. Entering Omar's room, he found him lying down, but with his eyes open, still processing everything that had happened. When their gazes met, they did not need to say anything. The silence between father and son was charged with emotion. Nicholas knew that he had saved his father's life, and Omar, despite the pain, knew that his son's love and courage had been the key to his survival. The police interrogators began with direct, no-nonsense questions. They knew that Daniel and Ricardo were weakened, both physically and emotionally, after the chase and arrest. The evidence against them was overwhelming, but crucial pieces of the puzzle were still missing, especially regarding Carmen's kidnapping. The truth needed to be extracted, and they needed to make sure nothing was left hidden. Ricardo, desperate and hopeless, began to explain how, after the trial, Daniel's anger and resentment, coupled with Miguel and Alex's feelings of humiliation, led them to plan retaliation against Omar and Judge Diego. He explained how at first the plan seemed simple, to kidnap Carmen and Omar as a way to destabilize Diego and make him pay for the sentence they believed unjust. Miguel and Alex's plan, to abandon Omar on a desert island to die slowly, seemed like a poetic punishment in the group's mind, a punishment that combined physical pain with emotional agony. But the kidnapping of Carmen, Diego's pregnant wife, had an even crueler purpose. They knew Diego would do anything to save his wife and child, and they wanted to see him destroyed by helplessness. She was his weak point, Ricardo confessed, his voice growing firmer as the words flowed. The judge. We knew he would do anything for her. The idea was to kidnap Carmen, to ask for the ransom, but really, what we wanted was to see her fall apart. We wanted her to suffer. The details of the plan were being revealed one by one, and as Ricardo spoke, Daniel, who until then had remained silent, began to show signs of irritation. He looked at Ricardo with contempt, realizing that his accomplice was revealing everything. Sensing that he was about to lose control of the situation, Daniel finally spoke. "Shut up, Ricardo," he shouted, his voice full of rage. But it was too late. The doors of truth had been thrown wide open, and there was no turning back. The interrogators continued to press. They knew the key to saving Carmen was there, in that room. They needed to find out where she was being held before it was too late. "Where is Carmen?" one of the interrogators asked, his voice filled with urgency. Time was of the essence, and they knew her and the baby's health was in danger. Ricardo, now in a cold sweat, hesitated. He glanced at Daniel, who remained with his jaw clenched, but knew there was no way to hide any longer. "She's in a house, an abandoned house on the outskirts of town," he murmured, looking away. "It was where we were going to keep her until we received the money. We didn't mean to hurt her, we just wanted the ransom." Nicholas, on the other side of the glass, closed his eyes for a moment. The relief of finally having a location for Carmen was great, but he knew the danger was still real. The rescue operation needed to be fast and precise. He couldn't risk losing any more time. Without hesitation, he left the observation room and began coordinating the next phase of the mission with his team. Ricardo's confession and the information obtained from the interrogations not only revealed Carmen's location, but also completely dismantled the revenge plan that had been carefully orchestrated. Now, everything was exposed. The hatred, envy, and thirst for power that had motivated Daniel and Ricardo were out in the open, and there was nowhere to run anymore. They would be held accountable for each of their acts. The time to capture those truly responsible for the dark plot of revenge had arrived. Ricardo's confession had revealed the location of Carmen, Judge Diego's wife, and the rescue operation was about to begin. Nicholas, his heart full of determination, led the special operations team, aware that every minute was vital to save Carmen and her baby. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as he and his team quickly advanced towards the abandoned house on the outskirts of the city, the place where Carmen was being held. The police convoy crossed the deserted streets at high speed, cutting through the silence of the early morning with sirens and flashing lights. Inside the vehicles, the atmosphere was tense, but focused. Nicholas, at the wheel of one of the patrol cars, felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had rescued his father, Omar, but now he had to ensure that Carmen, an innocent and pregnant woman, was taken from the clutches of her kidnappers. Every decision, every move he made, would be crucial to the success of the operation. When they finally arrived at the abandoned house, the patrol cars turned off their lights and the police moved silently, taking up strategic positions around the building. The construction was dilapidated, with broken windows and walls covered in moss, reflecting the abandonment and desperation that permeated the place. The plan was simple: a quick and silent entry, surprise the kidnappers and ensure that Carmen was safely rescued. Nicholas gave the last instructions to the team, with words full of authority, but also urgency. "She is in there. We cannot fail." With a signal from Nicholas, the team moved forward. Entry into the house was quick and efficient. The policemen forced open the door with precision, and within seconds they were inside. The interior was dark, with only a weak light illuminating the hallway. Nicholas's eyes adjusted to the darkness as he led the group down the hallway to the small room where Carmen was being held. The kidnappers, surprised, had no time to react. The policemen quickly overpowered the two men inside the house. They were handcuffed on the floor, and their attempts at resistance were immediately neutralized. Meanwhile, Nicholas advanced down the hallway to the room where Carmen was. He pushed open the door with a quick push, and there, in the dim light, he found the fragile figure of Carmen, sitting in a chair, tied up and with eyes full of fear. Nicholas ran to her, his hands shaking as he untied the ropes holding her wrists and ankles. Carmen, visibly shaken, looked at him with eyes filled with gratitude and relief. but also exhaustion. "You're safe now," Nicholas said in a soft voice, trying to reassure her. Carmen, though weak, took his hand, and tears began to roll down her face. The relief of finally being safe and knowing that her baby was okay too was overwhelming. The police officers began to lead Carmen out of the house, where an ambulance was already waiting to take her to the hospital. The tension in the air was beginning to dissipate, and the success of the rescue operation was evident. Carmen was safe. Nicholas felt the weight of the last few hours falling on his shoulders, but also a deep relief. He had done what he had to do. She was safe. However, Nicholas's work was not yet finished. Back at the police station, while Carmen was receiving medical treatment and Diego, her husband, was informed that his wife had been successfully rescued, justice was about to close in on Daniel, Ricardo, Miguel, and Alex. Everyone involved in the revenge plot was now in police custody. The confessions, evidence, and testimonies formed a strong case, and the trial was about to begin. The day of the trial had arrived, and the courtroom was filled with tension. The case of Daniel, Ricardo, Miguel, and Alex, the four men who had orchestrated a cruel revenge against Omar and Judge Diego, was about to reach its conclusion. The prosecutors began their closing argument, and each word seemed to weigh even more heavily on the shoulders of the accused. They recounted the events leading up to the trial, explaining how Daniel and Ricardo, driven by hatred and resentment after being convicted for their acts of abuse of power, decided to seek revenge. How they, along with Miguel and Alex, kidnapped Omar and Carmen, putting these people's lives at risk out of pure retaliation and malice. These men, the prosecutor began in a firm voice, not only attempted to destroy the life of a retired colonel, a man who dedicated his life to public service, but they also kidnapped a pregnant woman, putting her life and that of her child at risk. Their actions were premeditated, cruel, and motivated by a thirst for revenge inadmissible in a civilized society. They planned and executed a kidnapping with the intention of causing pain, suffering, and in Omar's case, a slow, lonely death. The evidence was presented once again. Ricardo's confessions, evidence that Daniel had been the mastermind behind the plan, and the images captured by security cameras showing the defendants' movements on the day of the kidnappings. It was impossible to deny their involvement. Everything was clear, and the defenses no longer had any strength. Daniel and Ricardo, who had previously seen themselves as victims of a system that they believed favored Omar and Judge Diego, were now faced with the reality of their decisions. When the defense attorney's turn came, they tried, in vain, to argue that the defendants had acted out of emotion following the previous trial. But the court was already convinced that what motivated these men was not a spur of the moment, but cold, premeditated revenge. They had time to reflect, plan, and act, and yet they still chose the path of violence and hatred. Finally, the judge took the floor. The silence in the room was total. All eyes were on him, waiting for the verdict that would put an end to this dark chapter. The judge, with a firm and serious voice, began to dictate the sentence. This court has reviewed all the evidence and has heard the testimonies. What has been clear throughout this process is that the defendants acted deliberately with the intention of causing irreparable harm to the victims. They planned and executed 2 kidnappings, one of them involving a pregnant woman, putting her life and that of her baby at risk. Their actions were motivated by revenge, without any consideration for the lives they were threatening. He paused, letting the weight of his words resonate in the room. For the crimes of kidnapping, conspiracy, and attempted murder, this court sentences Daniel, Ricardo, Miguel, and Alex to a term of 20 years in prison each, with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. Their actions were motivated by cruelty and malice, and this court believes that justice must be done. Upon hearing the sentence, the defendants showed no immediate reaction. Daniel, who had been the leader of the plan, remained motionless, as if he had already expected this outcome. Ricardo, who had confessed during the interrogation, lowered his head in resignation. Miguel and Alex, who had carried out Omar's kidnapping, were visibly shaken, but knew that their actions had brought them to this point of no return. As the defendants were led out of the courtroom, handcuffed, relief flooded through everyone present. Omar, although still bearing the scars of the kidnapping, felt that justice had finally been done. Carmen, at Diego's side, held her belly, and with tear-filled eyes knew that her future and that of her baby were safe. Nicholas, who had been the hero of this story, saving both his father and Carmen, remained silent, but with his heart full of pride. He had done his duty as a police officer and as a son, making sure that the guilty were held accountable. The cycle of revenge and pain had come to an end, and now they could all start anew.